So for this session, we're going to start Romanticism in America in general, and then in Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving. Had already started talking about Romanticism in America before. We had talked about its main characteristics, about Transcendentalism, if you remember, and so on. I'm going to share my screen in order to remind you a bit of these things. I'm not going to speak about them again. I'm just going to go over them very briefly in order to move to the short story we're speaking about today. So we know that the real American literature actually started with in the age of Romanticism, or by the 19th century. Before the 19th century, there was no concrete American literature. Most of the literature was either an imitation of the British literature, or came rather in form of letters, of reports of exploration, or of pamphlets. They were merely texts that were written for particular purposes. They were either colonial or calling for the revolution, but there was no real fiction. The real fiction only started in the 19th century, that is after the year 1800. So I'm going to share a document related to a document related to Transcendentalism in America, just to go over it, to go over the main concepts, the main themes in brief, as a reminder. Okay, do you see my screen now? I guess you do.
Yes.
So, all right. So when we're talking about Romanticism in America, of course, it has begun around 1836 to 1860. That is the 19th century. It began within the earliest part of the 19th century until the mid 19th century. In the beginnings of Romanticism, of the Romantic philosophy, originated through the end of the 18th century. This is regarding Britain. It started first in Britain, and then it traveled to America, as we have seen before in our previous classes. I just want to take you directly to the main concepts of Transcendentalism. Yes. So the main thing, or the first thing to remember about Transcendentalism, is that it is an offspring of Romanticism, but it is not Romanticism. It is different from Romanticism. Transcendentalism is particular to America. That is, Transcendentalism was born in America, and it came as a philosophy that represented the American character and the American spirit of the 19th century the most. It is an idealist way of thinking about American culture in this period. We are here in the beginnings of America as a nation, of the United States as a nation, and through time, the country is gaining more states, is gaining more power. It is expanding, and it's building the American identity and the American character and culture. Okay, so this is the period in which this culture is being constructed. So this philosophy, the philosophy of Transcendentalism, was related on the one side to the main events of the country, to the revolutions and so on, and on the other hand, to the expectations of these Americans, that is, the expectations of these philosophers and things they wanted to have in their society. So the first one was the value of nature. As just like the other romantics, nature is very important for the romantics, and it is also important for the transcendentalists. Actually, the transcendentalists thought that nature was so sacred, it had the same value as God, that if you respected nature, if you loved nature, if you felt immersed within nature, you actually could find the deep spirituality you can find when you have a connection with God. So nature is symbolic. The understanding the language of nature can bring us closer to God. That is, if you feel comfortable with nature, if you feel like you are immersing in nature, you actually have this strong connection, a spiritual connection with God. God is omnipresent. This is the second idea of the transcendentalists. God is everywhere and in everything. Omnipresence means he is everywhere and in everything. You can find him in everything. There is no need for specific religions or churches. Actually, the transcendentalists didn't believe in the need of having a religion. They thought that that is that the individual can actually have a strong relationship with God out of intuition. It all comes from the inner self, from the heart, from intuition, and not from religion. You do not need religion. You do not need a holy book or things to tell you what to do in order to be a good Christian. You are a good worshiper of God if you love Him, if you believe in Him. Number 3, man is divine. Nature is divine, which makes man divine. For there is a direct relationship with God. We are particles of God. Some of the transcendentalists actually believe that that man is so sacred that he is made in the image of God. That there are particles of I would say particles of God in man. No, that is not right. They believe that man is made in the image of God, that man is made as a particle of God, as a part of his beauty and his greatness. So they think that man is also very sacred. And there is the idea of the noble savage in transcendentalism, which we are going to see later, and which is related to this idea. The idea of the noble savage is that if man is living in isolation, he is entirely isolated from society. He is entirely isolated from outer influences, from cultural constructs, and so on, and thus please deactivate your microphone. Please deactivate your microphone, Sabrina. Sorry. Sorry, I just couldn't find all the buttons. It seems like there was a new update to the software and I cannot find myself anymore. Please do not activate your microphones whenever you are joining any session. So to get back to the idea of man's divinity or the sacredness of man, I was saying that the idea of the noble savage is that man, when living in total isolation without any connection with other human beings, becomes very sacred and achieves a very high level of nobility. Now, next, the idea of intuition. Every person is able to understand the right and wrong out of intuition. That is, you do not need to learn morality. Morality is something that you can learn through that's morality, sorry, or the difference between good and bad is something that you can learn from intuition or that you can get from intuition. The inner self is innately good. The human self is innately good. We are born as good people. And if you follow your instinct, if you follow your intuition, your inner self, you will always do good. Okay? Next idea, self-reliance. Now, self-reliance, I think, is the most important idea in Transcendentalism, and it's also related to the idea of the noble savage. Um, I will read the description. In self-reliance, intuition and natural instinct guide us to do the right things. In nature, we are uncorrupted. Yes, if you are living in nature, if you are living in total isolation from human beings, you are self-reliant. You are totally dependable on yourself only, not on outer, on other people, and there is no space for outer influence over yourself. You are entirely independent from the others, from their influences, from their let's say corruption. Okay, so it's also related to the idea of the noble savage and man's divinity. Actually, they all go hand in hand in Transcendentalism, but Transcendentalism is merely about the self-reliance, the idea of surviving by one's own, by living by one's own, and being the best version of oneself while being in isolation. That is, you can be the best self, or you can be the best version of yourself if you live in total isolation from other human beings. Other human beings and society and culture and so on are forms of corruption. We do not allow the human being to be himself. The human being is corrupted. They will lose their innocence while living in society. So, which comes to the next idea, which is society is a source of corruption. Society demands conformity, and conformity kills individuality. And this is an idea that is also shared with Romanticism, if you remember. Conformity means that the individual must conform to the society. They must conform to the ideals of society, their culture, and so on. So if you live in society, you are no longer yourself. You lose your innocence, and this is how you become corrupted. So corruption here is not, this is not the political sense of corruption, but corruption here means man is not being himself. Man is not being natural, or man is not being innocent, is not acting innocent. Man is actually acting according to the things that society wants from him. Okay. Next, idealism. So, as I said in the beginning, Transcendentalism itself is an idealist philosophy. It's a philosophy that acts for the well-being of society, of humanity, and so on. So it's all about idealism. Materialism is bad, just like all the romantics. Transcendentalists think that that materialism is a very bad thing, just like technology, because they corrupt the human being and they kill innocence. Emphasis on the here and now. Now, this is a very important idea for the Transcendentalists. The past is unimportant. Knowledge comes from experience. One cannot learn anything truly valuable from the past or from the people who lived before us. Knowledge was built on experience. That is, the past is not very important because the past is a source of information. This is different from the romantics. Okay. Transcendentalists here are different from the romantics because the romantics consider the past as a reference. They want to go back to the past. They have a nostalgia for the past. But the Transcendentalists do not want to go back to the past. Transcendentalists consider the past as a source of information, but we do not inspire from the past for the future. The future, or our present and our future, is our own making. We do not inspire from the past in order to live the present. We do not live by the ideals of the past. So the past is only a source of information, but it should be stopped because the present is our own. This is different from or rather, this is a point of difference with the Romantics, because Romanticism actually is a veneration of the past. The Romanticism is actually let's say, has a nostalgia for the past. Now, I should start talking about the Romantic period in America in general. Let me just share my document again. So the thing with the beginning of literature in America is that most of the authors were following the British tradition, the British writing tradition, long narratives, and so on. And most of the authors were accused of non-originality, and they were all trying to find their own writing. They were all trying to find their own system, or their own literature. Actually, I was reading a book entitled 19th Century American Literature this morning, and I was surprised that I ignored this book for all this time. I had this book for around 2 years, sorry, in my on my shelves, but I never actually looked at the book, or I never actually tried to read the book. I was ignoring the book for all this time, and I regret having ignored it, because I found so many things about literature, about American literature of the period. And I'm going to share the cover of the book with you now. The book is actually available in Maktabat Shams downtown. I bought it 2 years ago, but it's still available there. I was there about a month ago, and I found it there. So, according to this book, 19th century literature in America was influenced by the British tradition, but then the authors were trying to find their own literature, and were inspired by Walter Scott, who was himself a romantic, and whose writing, he was a British romantic, but who was writing about politics. And this came as a spark, or this made a spark of inspiration for the American writers who started writing about history and about the politics of their country, something that they didn't do before. And this was the birth of what is known as the historical romantic, the historical romance. Historical romance is not related to romanticism. It simply means writing fiction about history, that is writing history in the form of fiction, in the form of narrative. So the book says that they are the themes, or the ideas of land, legitimacy of the frontier, actually created the real beginning of American literature. I'm going to write this down. That is, the real beginning of American literature started with the ideals, or the themes of the landscape, nationalism too, and the frontier. Landscape, nationalism, and the frontier. Now, the frontier is something we are going to speak about more thoroughly in third year in realism. It's the frontier between the East and the West, because the East was imitating Britain in everything, while the West was more wild, and there were many civil wars in the West. There were many states that were not American back then, and they were annexed to America a few years later. So the West was wider. The West, there were many problems in the West. So the frontier is this cultural frontier between the East and the West. So the idea of landscape, nationalism, and the frontier, these are the main concepts, or the main themes that have participated in the building or the construction of real American literature. Landscape, nationalism, and the frontier. American literature, sorry, of American literature. So I should mention here that according to the book I was reading this morning, writing novels was considered not only alien, it was considered as irrational and including a lot of fiction. If you remember, we had talked about this in the rise of the novel last year. And one more factor for which authors didn't dare to write their own literature is that writing was considered as something feminine. It was considered as an action usually done by women, as an activity, sorry, usually done by women. So authors did not really dare to delve into writing. But by inspiring from Walter Scott, they had the idea of historicizing their culture. Okay, they had the idea of historicizing their culture, that is, writing their history based on the ideals of nationalism, landscape, and the frontier, and writing their own fictions. This is how American literature started, or actually began. That is, the idea of writing about history and politics sounded more masculine to them. Okay, the idea of writing history and politics sounded more masculine for American authors, as opposed to domestic issues, which were usually promoted for in feminine literature. Okay, so to recap, literature was considered as a feminine activity in the beginning because most of the literatures or most of the novels were written by women in this period and consumed by women. Most of them spoke of domestic issues like social relationships, love, marital issues, and so on. But then the idea of writing history and politics sounded more masculine. That is, it gave more courage, and it inspired more authors to dare and to start writing, because it brought something new and something different for them to start writing real American literature. And this is what happens when James Fenimore Cooper started writing American literature. Now, James Fenimore Cooper is considered as one of the most iconic. James Fenimore Cooper is considered as one of the most iconic figures in American literature. He is the author of The Last of the Mohicans. I guess you have seen this as a film. I think there are many films that are actually inspired from this novel. So The Last of the Mohicans, as well as other pieces, as well as other works by James Fenimore Cooper, actually considered the land and the truth of America, or that is the true character of America and the true history of America as a reference. So he wrote about the landscape, that is about nature and about the country. He wrote about the Native Americans, the Indians, and he wrote about real American stories. It was a period in which there was a great need of shedding light on real American culture, as opposed to rewriting old British stories. Okay, so I'm going to quote from the book here. He says he published, James Fenimore Cooper in 1821 published a book entitled The Spy, the tale of espionage and conflicting loyalties during the War of Independence. Now, this is an important idea because James Fenimore Cooper and many other authors, including Rip Van Winkle, whom we're going to speak about today, actually inspired from both the Revolution and the War of Independence. This is why you are often going to find stories, or you are often going to find tales of spies and detective stories in American literature more than any other literature. So he says, the tale of espionage and conflicting loyalties during the War of Independence to great acclaim. It was his next novel that Cooper found the subject and created the character that would cement his place in American literary history. The Pioneer was the first of a series of 5 novels that became known as the Leatherstocking Tales, after one of the nicknames, and so on. So in this, I'm going to skip a few lines here just to get to the idea that was attracting to me this morning. Yeah, the central theme was the settlement of the frontier, the disappearance of both American wilderness and its Native American inhabitants before the unstoppable advance of white Anglo-American civilization. Okay, so it says here that the main themes or the central themes of this literature had to do with the frontier and the real American history, merely that of the natives, which existed in America before before the Anglo-American civilization. Civilization, which came later. All right. So the reason why I started with this introduction is just to shed light on the real beginnings of the American fiction or American literature in the 19th century. So he said that it was an attempt to break with the tradition or with the British tradition in literature, that is the British writing tradition, and to find a real American character of writing, or to find a real American literature. It was the need of actually inventing the American literature, because it didn't exist before. So one of the things that have led these authors to take their courage and to dare this literature is historicizing the culture. That is the fact of including history, including the frontier, the landscape, sorry, and the frontier in their literature. It was the idea of including the country and its history in writing, which made the beginning of real American literature. If I am confusing to you, please stop me and ask your questions. The fact that I cannot see you or see your faces, hear your reactions, is somehow confusing to me, and I think you can see it. Now, so if you have any problems or if you feel lost, please activate your microphone and speak. You can ask your questions. All right, you don't seem to have any problems, so I'm going to move on. Most of the American literature actually came in form of short story. Okay, so the short story was not born in American literature. The short story always existed. It existed for a very long time. But in the 19th century, the American authors have, let's say, they gave a new, they kind of renewed the short story. They gave it a new renaissance, if I can use this term. That is, they have used the short story differently. It is shorter than the novel, than the usual novel, and usually it has one plot and it is about one main character. And the thing with the American short story is the same thing, or the idea of the American short story is the same thing as the idea we were speaking about earlier. It was the need of creating the real American literature. So authors were trying to avoid imitating the British writers. Some of them did actually write novels, but in their attempt to break with the British tradition and find something new, they switched to the short story. This is one. The second factor that led these authors into switching to to the short story. We said the first factor was break-in, with the British tradition. The second factor was technology and commerce. Now, authors are writing for income. I think you remember that we have spoken about this in the beginning of in the rise of the novel, and it's somehow the same idea here. Now, authors are writing for an income, and they are trying to publish their stories in newspapers, in magazines, and so on. And these magazines and newspapers offered very limited spaces for these pieces of writing. So authors could not write novels and publish them in newspapers. They would be too long. This is why they opted for short stories. It was much easier to publish short stories in journals and newspapers, in magazines and newspapers than it was for novels. And actually, the tradition of publishing short stories in magazines survived for a very long time, because until the 1960s, until the 1950s and the 1960s, authors were still publishing their short stories in magazines and in newspapers. So the most of the literature of the period came in the form of short story, merely for these two main factors. First one is breaking with the British tradition. Second one, technology and commerce, and the fact that industrialization obliged these authors to write something smaller and shorter than the traditional classic novel. And one more factor, and just find it. There was something very interesting I had read this morning. Yeah, I quote here: "For many American fiction writers, the publication of short work in periodical magazines provided a means of establishing their literary reputation, and just as importantly, a vital source of income at a time when the lack of international copyright laws meant that it was hard for aspiring writers to gain foothold in the literary marketplace." Okay, so this is just to confirm the idea I was speaking about earlier, that it was technology and commerce that actually led them to this. I cannot exactly remember why I read that this morning, but there was also one factor that said that a lot of people were actually trying to find something short to read. That people in the 19th century in America were not interested in reading long narratives, and were more interested in reading very short narratives. So readership, or the reading public, the reading public also has a great role here in the in waging for the short story. That is, these authors or these people were trying to find something short to stick to, or something short to read. It was much easier to read short stories than reading long narratives. Okay, I have tried to summarize the beginning of American literature and the ideals of Romanticism in these few points. I don't know if I have been confusing to you, or you have been following me. If you think that there are any problems, please stop me and speak now. Let me check the conversation if you have any problems or questions. Please, if you have any problems or questions, either write them in the chat section or ask your questions. You can activate your microphones and speak, or write your questions. Okay, there are no questions. I can now move on. So I'm going to start talking about Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle. As usual, I am not going to tell you the story. I need you to tell me the story. Can you tell me about the story? What is the story about? You can activate your microphone and speak. I can hardly